In a letter to Robert Morris, dated Mount Vernon, April 12, 1786, he says, I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it, slavery. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. And this, as far as my suffrage will go, shall never be wanting. He says in a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette, April 5th, 1783, the scheme, my dear Marquis, which you propose as a precedent to encourage the emancipation of the black people in this country in which they are held, is striking evidence of the benevolence of your heart. I shall be happy to join you in so laudable a work, but will defer going into a detail of the business till I have the pleasure of seeing you. In another letter to Lafayette, he says, the benevolence of your heart, my dear Marquis, is so conspicuous on all occasions that I never wonder at any fresh proofs of it, but your late purchase of an estate in the colony of Cayenne, with the view of emancipating the slaves on it, is a genuine and noble proof of your humanity. Would to God a like spirit might diffuse itself generally into the minds of the people of this country. In a letter to Sir John Sinclair, he further said, there are in Pennsylvania laws for the gradual abolition of slavery which neither Virginia or Maryland have at present, but which nothing is more certain that they must have, and at a period not remote. From his last will and testament we make the following extract. Upon the decease of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom. To emancipate them during her life would, though earnestly wished by me, be attended with such insufferable difficulties on account of their intermixture by marriage with the dowager negroes, as to excite the most painful sensation, if not disagreeable consequences from the latter, while both descriptions are in the occupancy of the same proprietor, it not being in my power, under the tenure by which the dower negroes are held, to manumit them. The dower negroes being the negroes that Martha Washington owned in her own right when she married George. It is said that when Mrs. Washington learned from the will of her deceased husband that the only obstacle to the immediate perfection of this provision was her right of dower, she at once gave it up and the slaves were made free. A man might possibly concentrate within himself more real virtue and influence than ever Washington possessed, and yet he would not be too good for such a wife. From the father of his country we now turn to the author of the Declaration of Independence. We will listen to the voice of Jefferson. On the 39th and 40th pages of his Notes on Virginia, Jefferson says, there must doubtless be an unhappy influence on the manners of our people produced by the existence of slavery among us. The whole commerce between master and slave is a perpetual exercise of the most boisterous passions, the most unremitting despotism on one part, and degrading submission on the other. Our children see this and learn to imitate it. For man is an imitative animal. The quality of this germ of all education is in him. From his cradle to his grave, he is learning to do what he sees others do. If a parent could find no motive, either in his philanthropy or his self-love, for restraining the intemperance of his passion towards his slave, it should always be a sufficient one that his child is present. But generally, it is not sufficient. The parent storms, the child looks on, catches the lineaments of wrath, puts on the same airs in the circle of smaller slaves, gives a loose rein to the worst of passions, and thus nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny cannot but be stamped by it with an odious peculiarity. The man must be a prodigy who can retain his manners and morals undepraved by such circumstances, and with what execration should the statesman be loaded, who, permitting one half of the citizens thus to trample on the rights of the other, transforms those into despots, and these into enemies, destroys the morals of one part, and the amor patria of the other. For if a slave can have a country in this world, It must be any other in preference to that in which he was born to live and labor for another, in which he must look upon the faculties of his own nature, contribute as far as depends on his individual endeavors, the banishment of the human race, or entail his own miserable conditions on the endless generations proceeding from him. With the morals of the people, their industry also is destroyed. For in a warm climate no man will labor for himself who can make another labor for him. This is so true that the proprietors of slaves, a very small proportion indeed, are ever seen to labor. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis of conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I realize that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only, a revolution of the wheel of fortune and an exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may be probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. While Virginia was yet a colony in 1774, she held a convention to appoint delegates to attend the first General Congress, which was to assemble and did assemble in Philadelphia in September of that year. Before the convention, Mr. Jefferson made an exposition of the rights of British Americans in which he said, "The abolition of domestic slavery is the greatest object of desire in the colonies, where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves, it is necessary to exclude further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibition and by imposing duties on which might amount to prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantage of a few African corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states and the rights of human nature, deeply wounded by this infamous practice." In the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, of which it is well known he was the author, we find this charge against the King of Great Britain. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain, determined to keep a market where men should be bought and sold. He has at length prostituted his negative for suppressing any legislative attempt to prohibit and restrain this execrable commerce. Hearing further, he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they were endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Under the date of August 7, 1785, in a letter to Dr. Price of London, he says, "Northward of the Chesapeake you may find here and there an opponent of your doctrines, or you may find them here and there a robber and a murderer, but in no great number. Emancipation is put into such a train that in a few years there will be no slaves northward of Maryland. In Maryland I do not find such a disposition to begin the redress of this enormity as in Virginia. This is the next state to which we may turn our eyes for the interesting spectacle of justice in conflict with the avarice sad oppression, a conflict wherein the sacred side is gaining daily recruits from the influx into office of young men grown up and growing up. These have sucked in the principles of liberty, as it were, as their mother's milk, and it is to them I look with anxiety to turn the fate of the question." In another letter written to a friend, he made use of the following emphatic language: "Your favor of July 31st is duly received and read with peculiar pleasure. The sentiments do honor to the head and heart of the writer. Mine on the subject of slavery of Negroes has long since been in the possession of the public, and time is only served to give them stronger root. The love of justice and the love of the country plead equally the cause of these people, and it is a reproach to us that they should have pleaded it so long in vain. Again he said, what an incomprehensible machine is man! Who can endure toil, famine, stripes, imprisonment, and death itself in vindication of his own liberty, and the next moment be deaf to all those motives whose power supported him through his trial, and inflict on his fellow man a bondage, 1 hour of which is fraught with more misery than ages of that which he rose in rebellion to oppress? Throughout the South, at the present day, especially among slaveholders, Negroes are almost invariably spoken of as goods and chattel, property, human cattle. In our first quotation from Jefferson's works, we have seen that he spoke of the blacks as citizens. We'll now hear him speak of them as brethren. He said, we must wait with patience the workings of an overruling providence, and hope that is preparing the deliverance of these our brethren. When the measure of their tears shall be full, when their groans shall have involved heaven itself in the darkness, doubtless a God of justice will awaken to their distress. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate that these people shall be free. In a letter to James Heaton on this same subject, dated May 20th, 1826, only 6 weeks before his death, he says, my sentiments have been 40 years before the public. Had I repeated them 40 times, they would have only become the more stale, and threadbare. Although I shall not live to see them consummated, they will not die with me. From the father of the Declaration of Independence, we now turn to the father of the Constitution. We will listen to the voice of Madison. Advocating the abolition of the slave trade, Mr. Madison said, the dictates of humanity, the principles of the people, the national safety and happiness, and prudent policy require it of us. It is to be hoped that by expressing a national disapproval of the trade, we may destroy it and save our country from reproaches and our posterity from the imbecility ever attendant a country filled with slaves. Again, he said, it is wrong to admit into the Constitution the idea that there can be property in man. In The Federalist, number 39, he says, the first question that offers itself is whether the general form and aspect of the government be strictly Republican. It is evident that no other form would be reconcilable with the genius of the people of America and with the fundamental principles of the Revolution, or with that honorable determination which animates every votary of freedom to rest all our political experiments on the capacity of mankind for self-government. To the Federal Convention, he says, and in the third place where slavery exists, the Republican theory becomes still more fallacious. On another occasion, he says, we have seen the mere distinction of color made, in the most enlightened period of time, a ground of the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. That ends the reading of James Madison. Now we will go to James Monroe. In a speech in the Virginia Convention, Mr. Monroe said, we have found that this evil has preyed upon the very vitals of the Union and has been prejudicial to all the states in which it has existed. Now, here's Patrick Henry. The eloquent Patrick Henry says in a letter dated January 18th, 1773, it is not a little surprising that the professors of Christianity, whose chief excellence consists in softening the human heart, in cherishing and improving its finer feelings, should encourage a practice so totally repugnant with the first impressions of right and wrong. What adds to the wonder is that this abomination practically has been introduced in the most enlightened ages. Times seem to have pretensions to boast of high improvements in the arts and sciences, and refined morality have brought into general use and guarded by many laws a species of violence and tyranny which our more rude and barbarous but more honest ancestors detested. It is not amazing that at a time when the rights of humanity are defined and understood with precision in a country above all and fond of liberty, that in such an age and in such a country we find men professing a religion the most mild, humane, gentle, and generous, adopting such a principle as repugnant to humanity as it is inconsistent with the Bible and destructive to liberty. Every thinking, honest man rejects it in speculation. How free in practice from conscientious motives? Would anyone believe that I am a master of slaves in my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living here without them. I will not, I cannot justify it. However culpable my conduct, I will so far pay my devoir to virtue as to own the excellence and rectitude of her precepts and lament my want of conformity to them. I believe a time will come when an opportunity will be offered to abolish this lamentable evil. Everything we can do to improve it, if it happens in our day. If not, let us transmit to our descendants, together with our slaves, a pity for their unhappy lot and an abhorrence for slavery. If we cannot reduce this wished-for reformation to practice, let us treat the unhappy victims with lenity. It is the furthest advance we can make toward justice. It is a debt we owe to the purity of our religion to show that it is at variance with the law that warrants slavery. Again, this great orator says, I would rejoice my very soul that every one of my fellow beings are emancipated. We ought to lament and deplore the necessity of holding our fellow men in bondage. Believe me, I shall honor the Quakers for their noble efforts to abolish slavery. Now, that finishes up Patrick Henry. Here's the voice of John Randolph. The eccentric genius John Randolph of Roanoke, in a letter to William Gibbons in 1820, says, with unfeigned respect and regard, and as sincere a depreciation on the extension of slavery and its horrors as any other man, be him whom he may, I am your friend in the literal sense of that much abused word. I say much abused because it is applied to the league of vice and avarice and ambition, instead of good, which will toward man from the love of him who is the Prince of Peace. While in Congress, he says, Sir, I envy neither the heart nor the head of the man from the North who rises here to defend slavery on principle. It is well known that he emancipated all his Negroes. The following lines from his will are worth perusing and preserving. I give to my slaves their freedom, to which my conscience tells me they are justly entitled. It has a long time been a matter of the deepest regret to me that the circumstances under which I inherited them and the obstacles thrown in the way by the laws of the land have prevented my emancipating them in my lifetime, which is my full intention to do in case I can accomplish it. Now here's a letter from Thomas M. Randolph. In an address to the Virginia legislature in 1820, Governor Randolph said, We have been far outstripped by slaves, to whom nature has been far less bountiful. It is painful to consider what might have been, under other circumstances, the amount of general wealth in Virginia. Now here's Thomas Jefferson Randolph. In 1832, Mr. Randolph of Albemarle in the legislature of Virginia used the following most graphic and emphatic language. I agree with gentlemen in the necessity of arming the state for internal defense. I will unite with them in any effort to restore confidence to the public mind and to conduce the sense of the safety of our wives and our children. Yet, sir, I must ask upon whom it is to fall the burden of this defense, not upon the lordly masters of their hundreds of slaves, who will never turn out except to retire with their families when danger threatens. No, sir, it is to fall upon the less wealthy class of our citizens, chiefly upon the non-slaveholder. I have known patrols turned out when there was not a slaveholder among them, and this is the practice of the country. I have slept in times of alarm, quiet in bed, without having a thought of care, while these individuals, owning none of the property themselves, were patrolling under a compulsory process for a pittance of 75 cents per 12 hours, the very curtilage of my house, and guarding that property, which was dangerous to them and myself. After all, this is but an expedient. As the population becomes more numerous, it will become less productive. Your guard must be increased until finally its profits will not pay for the expense of its subjection. Slavery has the effect of lessening the free population of a country. The gentleman has spoken of the increase of the female slaves being a part of the profit. It is admitted, but no great evil can be averted, no good attained, without some inconvenience. It may be questioned how far it is desirable to foster and encourage this branch of profit. It is a practice, and an increasing practice in parts of Virginia, to rear slaves for market. How can an honorable mind, such a patriot and lover of the country, bear to see this ancient dominion rendered illustrious by the noble devotion and patriotism of her sons in the cause of liberty, converted into one grand menagerie where men are to be reared for the market like oxen for the shambles? Is it better, not for the worse, that the slave trade, that the trade which enlisted the labor of the good and wise of every creed and every clime, to abolish it? The trader receives the slaves, a stranger in language, aspect, and manners, from the merchant who has brought him from the interior. The ties of the father, husband, mother, and child have all been rent in twain. Before he receives them, his soul has become callous. But here, sirs, individuals, whom the master has known from infancy, whom he has seen sporting on the innocent gambols of childhood, whom have been accustomed to look to him in protection as he tears up from his mother's arms and sells into a storage country among strange people subject to cruel taskmasters. He has attempted to justify slavery here because it exists in Africa, and has stated that it exists all over the world. Upon the same principle, he could justify Mohammedanism, with its plurality of wives, petty wars for plunder, robbery and murder, or any other abomination and enormities of savage tribes. Does slavery exist in any part of civilized Europe? No, sir. Not in any part of it. And that's it for him. Peyton Randolph. On the 20th of October, 1774, while Congress was in session in Philadelphia, Peyton Randolph, president of the following resolution, among others, was unanimously adopted that we will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade, and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels and sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it. Edmund Randolph. The Constitution of the United States contains the following provision: no person held to service of or labor in another state under laws thereof, escaping to another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom much service or labor may be due. To the studious attention of those vandals who contend that the above provision requires the rendition of fugitive slaves, we respectfully commend the following resolution, which, it will be observed, was unanimously adopted. On motion of Mr. Randolph, the word servitude was struck out and service unanimously inserted, the former being thought to express the condition of slaves, the latter the obligation of free persons. Madison Papers, Volume 3, page 1569. Well done for the Randolphs. The voice of Henry Clay. Henry Clay, whom everyone loved, and at the mention of whose name the American heart always throbs with emotions of grateful remembrance, said in an address before the Kentucky Colonialization Society in 1829, "It is believed that nowhere in the farming portion of the United States would slave labor be generally employed, if the proprietor were not tempted to raise slaves by the high price of the southern market, which keeps it up in his own." In the United States Senate in 1850, he used the following memorable words: "I am extremely sorry to hear the senator from Mississippi say that he requires first the extension of the Missouri Compromise line out to the Pacific, and also that he is not satisfied with that, but requires, if I understand him correctly, a positive provision for the admission of slavery south of that line. And now, sir, coming from a slave state as I do, I owe it to myself, I owe it to truth, I owe it to the subject to say that no earthly power could induce me to vote for a specific measure for the introduction of slavery where it had not been before existed, either south or north of that line. Coming as I do from a slave state, it is my solemn, deliberate, and well-matured determination that no power, no earthly power, shall compel me to vote for the positive introduction of slavery either north or south of that line. Sir, while you reproach, and justly too, our British ancestors for the introduction of the institution upon the continent of the Americas, I am, for one, unwilling that the posterity of the present inhabitants of California and New Mexico shall reproach us for doing just what we reproach Great Britain for doing to us. If the citizens of those territories choose to establish slavery, and if they come here with constitutions establishing slavery, I am for admitting them with such provisions in their constitution. But then it will be their own work and not ours, and their posterity will have to reproach them and not us for forming constitutions allowing the institution of slavery to exist among them. These are my views, sir, and I choose to express them, and I care not how extensively or universally they are known. Here Clay further, he says, so long as God allows the vital current to flow through my veins, I will never, never, by word, by thought, by mind, or by will, aid in admitting one rood of free territory in the everlasting curse of human bondage. A bumper to the memory of noble Harry of the West. Cassius Clay, Henry Clay's cousin. Of the great number of good speeches made by members of the Republican Party during the late presidential campaign, it is, we believe, pretty generally admitted that the best one was made by Cassius M. Clay of Kentucky at the Tabernacle in New York City on the 24th of October, 1856. From the speech of that noble champion of freedom then and there delivered, we make the following graphic extract. If there are no manufacturers, there is no commerce. In vain do the slaveholders go to Knoxville, to Nashville, to Memphis, and to Charleston, and resolve that they will have nothing to do with these abolition 18 million of northern people, that they will build their own vessels, manufacture their own goods, ship their own products to foreign countries, and break down New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Again, they resolve and re-resolve, and yet there is not a single ton more shipped and not a single article added to the wealth of the South. But gentlemen, they never invite such men as I am to attend to their conventions. They know that I would tell them that slavery is the cause of their poverty, and that I will tell them that what they are aiming at is the dissolution of the Union, that they may be prepared by slave labor. The very propositions which they make can never be realized. Yet when we show these things, they cry out, oh, cotton is king. But when we look at the statistics, we find that so far from cotton being king, grass is king. There are 9 articles of staple production which are larger than that of cotton in this country. I suppose it does not follow, because slavery is endeavoring to modify the great dicta of our fathers, that cotton and free labor are incompatible. In the extreme South at New Orleans, the laboring men, the stevedores and hackmen on the levee, where the heat is intensified by the proximity of the red brick buildings, all of them are white men, and they are in the full enjoyment of health. But how about cotton? I am informed by a friend of mine, himself a slaveholder and therefore good authority, that in northwestern Texas, among the German settlements, who, true to their national instincts, will not employ the labor of a slave, they produce more cotton to the acre, and of a better quality, and selling at prices from a cent to a cent and a half a pound higher than that produced by slave labor. This is an experiment that illustrates what I have always held, that whatever is right is expedient. The voice of Benton. In his 30 years' view, Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri said, my opposition to the extension of slavery dates further back than 1844, 40 years further back. And as this is a suitable time for a general declaration and a sort of a general conscious delivery, I will say that my opposition to it dates from 1804, when I was a student at the law at the state of Tennessee and studied the subject of African slavery in an American book, a Virginia book, Tucker's edition of Blackstone's Commentaries. Again, in a speech delivered in St. Louis on the 3rd of November, 1854, he, that's Benton, says, I look at white people and not at black ones. I look to the peace and reputation of the race to which I belong. I look to the peace of this land, the world's last hope for a free government upon the earth. One of the occasions in which I saw Henry Clay rise higher than I thought I ever saw him before was when, in the debate on the admission of California, a dissolution was apprehended if slavery was not carried into the territory where it never was. Then Mr. Clay, rising, loomed colossally over the Senate of the United States as he rose, declaring that for no earthly purpose, no earthly object could he carry slavery into places where it did not exist before. It was a great and proud day for Mr. Clay toward the later days of his life, and if an artist could have been there to catch his expression as he uttered that sentiment, with its reflex on his face and his countenance beaming with a firmness of purpose, it would have been a glorious moment which to transmit him to posterity, his countenance all alive and luminous with the ideas that beat in his bosom. That was a proud day. I could have wished that I had spoken the same words. I speak them now, telling you they were his, and adopting them as my own. The voice of Mason. Colonel Mason, a leading and distinguished member of the convention that formed the Constitution from Virginia, where the provision for prohibiting the importation of slaves was under consideration, said, the present question concerns not the importing states alone, but of the whole Union. Slavery discourages arts and manufactures. The poor despises labor when performed by slaves. They prevent the emigration of whites who really enrich and strengthen a country. They produce the most pernicious effect on manners. Every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of cause and effect, Providence pushes national sins by national calamities. He lamented that some of our Eastern brethren had, from a lust of gain, embarked on this nefarious traffic. As to the states being in possession of the right to import, this was the case with many other rights now to be properly given up. He held it essential in every point of view that the general government should have the power to prevent the increase of slavery. The voice of Governor McDowell of Virginia. In 1832, Governor McDowell used this language in the Virginia legislature. Who that looks to this unhappy bondage of an unhappy people in the midst of our society and thinks of it, incidents or issues, but weeps over it as a curse as great upon him who inflicts it upon him who suffers it? Sir, you may place the slave where you please. You may dry up to your uttermost the foundations of his feelings and the springs of his thought. You may close upon his mind every avenue of knowledge and cloud it over with artificial night. You may yoke him to your labors as the ox which liveth only to work and worketh only to live. You may put him under any process which, without destroying his value as a slave, will debase and crush him as a rational being. You may do this, and the idea that he was born to be free will survive it all. It is allied to his hope of immortality. It is the ethereal part of his nature which oppression cannot rend. It is a torch lit up in his soul by the hand of the deity, and never meant to be extinguished by the hands of man. The voice of Iredell. In the debates of the North Carolina Convention, Mr. Iredell, afterward a judge of the United States Supreme Court, said, when the entire abolition of slavery takes place, it will be an event which must be pleasing to every generous mind and every friend of human nature. The voice of Pinckney. William Pinckney of Maryland in the House of Delegates in that state in 1789 made several powerful arguments in favor of the abolition of slavery. Here follows a brief extract from one of his speeches. Iniquitous and most dishonorable to Maryland is that dreary system of partial bondage which her laws have hitherto supported with a solicitude worthy of a better object, and her citizens by their practice countenanced, founded in a disgraceful traffic, to which the parent country lent its fostering aid for motives of interest, but which even she would have disdained to encourage had England been the destined part of such inhuman merchandise. Its countenance is as shameful as its origin. I have no hope that the stream of general liberty will live forever and flow unpolluted through the mire of partial bondage, or that they who have been habituated to lord it over others will not in time become base enough to let others lord over them. If they resist, it will be the struggle of pride and selfishness, not of principles. The voice of Lee. In the legislature of Virginia in 1832, Mr. Lee said, I thought till very lately that it was known to everybody that during the Revolution and for many years after the abolition of slavery was a favorite topic with many of our ablest statesmen who entertained with respect all the schemes which wisdom or ingenuity could suggest for its accomplishments. The voice of Marshall, Thomas Marshall of Fauquier County, Virginia, said in the Virginia legislature in 1832, Wherefore, then, object to slavery? Because it is ruinous to the whites, retards improvement, roots out an industrious population, bandages the yeomanry of the country, deprives the spinner, the weaver, the smith, the shoemaker, the carpenter of employment and support. The voice of Bowling. Philip A. Bowling of Buckingham, a member of the legislature of Virginia in 1832, said, The time will come, and it may be sooner than many are willing to believe, when this oppressed and degraded race cannot be held as they are now, when a change will be effected, abhorrent, Mr. Speaker, to you and to the feelings of every good man. The wounded adder will recoil and sting the foot that trample upon it. The day is approaching fast when those who oppose all action on this subject, and instead of aiding in devising sole feasible plan for freeing their country from an acknowledged curse, cry impossible to every plan suggested, will curse their perverseness and lament their folly. The voice of Chandler. Mr. Chandler of Norfolk, a member of the Virginia legislature in 1832, took occasion to say, It is admitted by all who have addressed this House that slavery is a curse and an increasing one, that it has been destructive to the lives of our citizens. History with unerring truth will record that in future increase it will create commotion, cannot be doubted. The voice of Summers. Mr. Summers of Kanawha, member of the legislature of Virginia in 1832, said this, The evils of this system cannot be enumerated, if it were unnecessary to attempt it. They glare upon us at every step. When the owner looks to his wasted estate, he knows and feels them. The voice of Preston. In the legislature of Virginia in 1832, Mr. Preston said, Sir, Mr. Jefferson, whose hands drew the preamble to the Bill of Rights, has eloquently remarked that we had invoked for ourselves the benefit of a principle which we had denied to others. He saw and felt that slaves as men were embraced within this principle. The voice of Fremont. John Charles Fremont, one of the noblest sons of the South, said, I heartily concur in all movements which have for their object to repair the mischiefs arising from the violation of good faith in the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. I am opposed to slavery in the abstract and upon principles sustained and made habitual by its long-settled convictions. I am inflexibly opposed to its extension on this continent beyond its present limits. The great body of non-slaveholding freemen, including those of the South, upon whose welfare slavery is an oppression, will discover that the power of the general government over the public lands may be beneficially exerted to advance their interests and will secure their independence. Knowing this, their suffrages will not be wanting to maintain the authority of the Union, which is absolutely essential to the maintenance of their own liberties, and which has more than once indicated the purpose of disposing the public lands in such a way that it would make every settler upon them a freeholder. The voice of Blair. In an address to the Republicans of Maryland in 1856, Francis P. Blair said, In every aspect in which slavery among us can be considered, it is pregnant with difficulty. Its continuance in the states in which it has taken root has resulted in the monopoly of the soil to the great extent in the hands of the slaveholders and the entire control of all departments of the state government, and yet a majority of people in the slave states are not slave owners. This produces an anomaly in the principle of our free institutions, which threatens in time to bring into subjugation to slave owners the great body of the free white population. The voice of Maury. Lieutenant Maury to whom has been awarded so much well-merited praise in the world of sciences, says, "The fact must be obvious to the far-reaching minds of our statesmen that unless some means of relief can be devised, some channel afforded by which the South can, when the time comes, get rid of the excess of her slave population, she will ultimately found with regard to this institution in the predicament of the man with the wolf by the ears, too dangerous to hold on any longer and equally dangerous to let go. To our mind, the event is as certain to happen as an event which depends on the contingencies of the future, viz., that unless means be devised for gradually relieving the slave states from the undue pressure of this class upon them, unless some way be opened by which they may be rid of their surplus black population. The time will come, it may not be in the next nor in the succeeding generation, but sooner or later come it will, and come it must, when the two races will join in the death struggle for the mastery." The voice of Birney, James G. Birney of Kentucky, under whom the abolitionists first became a national party, and for whom they voted for president in 1844, giving him 66,304 votes, says, "We have so long practiced injustice, adding to it hypocrisy in the treatment of the colored race, both Negroes and Indians, that we begin to regard justice as an element, a chief element, the chief element of our government. But no government which admits injustice as an element can be a harmonious one or a permanent one. Harmony is the antagonist of injustice, ever has been and ever will be, that is, so long as injustice lasts, which cannot always be, for it is a lie, a semblance therefore perishable. True, from the imperfection of man, his ambition and selfishness, injustice often finds its way incidentally into the administration of public affairs, and maintains its footing a long time before it is cast out over by the legitimate elements of government. Our slave states, especially the more southern of them, in which the number of slaves is greater, in which, of course, the sentiment of injustice is stronger than the more northern ones, are to be placed on the list of decaying communities. To a philosophic observer, they seem to be falling back on the scale of civilization. Even at the present point of retrogression, the cause of civilization and human improvement would lose nothing by their annihilation." The voice of Delaware, strong anti-slavery sentiment had become popular in Delaware as early as 1785, with Maryland and Missouri. It may now be ranked as a semi-slave state. Mr. McLean, a member of Congress from this state in 1825, said, "I shall not imitate the example of other gentlemen by making profession of my love of liberty and abhorrence of slavery, not, however, because I do not entertain them. I am an enemy of slavery." The voice of Maryland. Slavery has little vitality in Maryland. Baltimore, the greatest city of the South, greatest because it's freest, has a population of more than 200,000 souls, and yet less than 3,000 of these are slaves. In spite of all the unjust and oppressive statutes enacted by the oligarchy, the non-slaveholders, who are the exception of a small number of slaveholding emancipationists, may in truth be said to be the only class of respectable and patriotic citizens in the South, have wisely determined that their noble state shall be freed from the sin and shame, the crime and curse of slavery, and in accordance with this determination long since formed, they are giving every possible encouragement to free white labor, thereby very properly rendering the labor of slaves both unprofitable and disgraceful. The formation of an abolition society in the state in 1789, with the result of an influence of the masterly speeches delivered in the House of Delegates by the Honorable William Pinckney, whose undying testimony we have already placed on record. Nearly 70 years ago, this eminent lawyer and statesman declared to the people of America that if they did not mark out the bounds of slavery and adopt measures for its total extinction, it would finally work a decay of the spirit of liberty in the free states. Further, he said that by the eternal principles of natural justice, no master in the state has a right to hold his slave in bondage a single hour. 1787, Luther Martin of this state said, "Slavery is inconsistent with the genius of republicanism and has a tendency to destroy those principles on which it is supported, as it lessens the sense of equal rights of mankind and habituates us to tyranny and oppression." The voice of Virginia. After introducing the unreserved and immortal testimony of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Henry, and the other great men of the Old Dominion against the institution of slavery, it may to some seem quite superfluous to back the cause of freedom by arguments from other Virginia abolitionists. But this state, notwithstanding all her more modern manners and inhumanity, has been so prolific of just views and noble sentiments that we deem it eminently fit and proper to blazon many of them to the world as the redeeming features of her history. An abolition society was formed in Virginia in 1791. In memorial which the members of this society presented to Congress, they pronounced slavery as not only an odious degradation, but an outrageous violation of one of the most essential rights of human nature and utterly repugnant to the precepts of the gospel. A Bill of Rights, unanimously agreed upon by the Virginia Convention on June 12, 1776, holds that all men are by nature equally free and independent. The government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. That elections of members to serve as representatives of the people in assembly ought to be free. That all men having sufficient evidence of permanent common interests with an attachment to the community have the right of suffrage and cannot be taxed or deprived of their property for public uses without their own consent or that of their representatives so elected, nor bound by any law to which they have not in like manner assented for the public good. That the freedom of the press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. That no free government or the blessing of liberty can be preserved to any people but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by a frequent recurrence to fundamental principles. The Virginia Society for the Abolition of Slavery, organized in 1791, addressed Congress in these words: Your memorialist, fully aware that righteousness exalteth a nation, and that slavery is not only an odious degradation, but an outrageous violation of one of the most essential rights of human nature, and utterly repugnant to the precepts of the gospel, which breathes peace on earth and goodwill to men, lament that a practice so inconsistent with true policy and the inalienable rights of man should subsist in so enlightened an age and among a people professing that all mankind are by nature equally entitled to freedom. The voice of North Carolina. If the question slavery or no slavery could be fairly presented for the decision of the legal voters of North Carolina at the next popular election, we believe that at least two-thirds of them would deposit the no slavery ticket. Perhaps one-fourth of the slaveholders themselves would vote it, for the slaveholders in this state are more moderate, decent, sensible, and honorable than the slaveholders in either of the adjoining states or the states further south, and we know that many of them are heartily ashamed of the vile occupations of slaveholding and slave breeding in which they are engaged, for we have the assurance from their own lips. As a matter of course, all the non-slaveholders who are so greatly in the majority would vote to suppress the degrading institution which has kept them so long in poverty and ignorance, with the exception of those who are complete automatons to the beck and call of their imperious lords and masters, the major generals of the oligarchy. How long shall it be before the citizens of North Carolina shall have the privilege of expressing at the ballot box their true sentiments with regard to this vexed question? Why not decide it at the next general election? Sooner or later it must and will be decided. Decided correctly, too, and the sooner the better. The first Southern state that abolishes slavery will do herself an immortal honor. God grant that North Carolina may be that state, and soon. There is at least one plausible reason why this good old state should be the first to move in this important matter, and we will state it. On the 20th of May, 1775, just 1 year, 1 month, and 14 days prior to the adoption of the Jeffersonian Declaration of Independence by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, July 4, 1776, the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, the authorship of which is generally attributed to Ephraim Brevard, was proclaimed in Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, and fully ratified in a second convention of the people of said county held on the 31st of the same month. And here, by the way, we may remark that it is supposed Mr. Jefferson made use of this last mentioned document as the basis of his draft of the indestructible title deed of our liberties. There is certainly an identicalness of language between the two papers that is well calculated to strengthen this hypothesis. This, however, is a controversy about which we are but little concerned. For present purposes, it is perhaps enough for us to know that on the 20th of May, 1775, when transatlantic tyranny and oppression could no longer be endured, North Carolina set her sister colonies a most valorous and praiseworthy example, and that they followed it. To her infamous slave-holding sisters of the South, it is now meet that she should set another noble example of decency, virtue, and independence. Let her at once inaugurate a policy of common justice, humanity, enact a system of equitable laws having due regard to the rights and interests of all classes of persons, poor whites, Negroes, nabobs, and the surrounding states will ere long applaud her measures and adopt similar ones for the governance of themselves. Another reason, and a cogent one, why North Carolina should aspire to become the first free state of the South is this: the first slave state that makes herself respectable by casting out the mother of harlots and by rendering enterprise and industry honorable, will immediately receive a large accession of most worthy citizens from other states in the Union, and thus lay a broad foundation of permanent political power and prosperity. Intelligent white farmers from the Middle and New England states will flock to our more congenial climate, eager to give $30 per acre for the same lands that are now a drug in the market because nobody wants them at the rate of $5 per acre. An immediate and powerful impetus will be given to commerce, manufacturers, and all the industrial arts. Science and literature will be revived, and every part of the state will reverberate with the triumphs of manual and intellectual labor. At the present time, we of North Carolina are worth less than either of the four adjoining states. Let us abolish slavery at the beginning of the next regular decade of years, and if our example is not speedily followed, we shall honor before. The first day of January 1870, being able to purchase the whole of Virginia and South Carolina, including perhaps the greater part of Georgia. He's being a little facetious here, but what he's saying is a free state will become more wealthy in a much quicker time than a slave state will. In other words, slavery is holding the state back. That's his whole theory here. An exclusive lease of liberty for 10 years would unquestionably make us the Empire State of the South, but we have no disposition to debar others from the enjoyment of liberty or any other inalienable right. We ask no special favors. What we demand for ourselves, we are willing to concede to our neighbors. Hereby we make application for a lease of freedom for 10 years. Shall we have it? May God enable us to secure it as we believe he will. We give fair notice, however, that if we get it for 10 years, we shall, with the appropriation of heaven, keep it 20, 40, 1,000, keep it forever. Never had no way of knowing as he's writing this, because he wrote it in 1856 and it was published in 1857, that in 4 years the entire country would literally be blood sport. So just remember that. We transcribe the Mecklenburg resolutions, in which it will be observed, acknowledge the inherent and inalienable rights of man, and declare ourselves a free and independent people, and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association under the control of no power other than that of our God and the general government of Congress. Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, as proclaimed in the town of Charlotte, North Carolina, May 20th, 1775, and ratified by the county of Mecklenburg in convention, May 31st, 1775. 1. Resolved that whosoever, directly or indirectly, abetted or in any way, form, or manner countenanced the unchartered and dangerous invasion of our rights as claimed by Great Britain is an enemy to this country, to America, and to the inherent and alienable rights of man. 2. Resolved that we, the citizens of Mecklenburg County, do hereby dissolve the political bands which have connected us to the mother country, and hereby absolve ourselves from all allegiance to the British Crown, and abjure all political connections, contracts, or associations with that nation who have wantonly trampled on our rights and liberties and inhumanely shed the blood of American patriots at Lexington. 3. Resolved that we do hereby declare ourselves a free and independent people, and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association under the control of no power other than that of our God and the general government of the Congress. to the maintenance of which independence we solemnly pledge to each other our mutual cooperation, our lives, our fortunes, and our most sacred honor. 4. Resolved, that as we now acknowledge the existence and control of no law or legal officer, civil or military, within this county, we do hereby ordain and adopt as a rule of life all, each, and every of our former laws, wherein nevertheless the Crown of Great Britain never can be considered as holding rights, privileges, immunities, or authority therein. Had it not been for slavery, which, with all its other blighting and degrading influences, stifles and subdues every noble impulse of the heart, this consecrated spot would long since have been marked by an enduring monument whose grand proportions should bear witness that the virtues of a noble ancestry are gratefully remembered by an emulous and appreciative posterity. Yet even as things are, we are not without genuine consolation. The star of hope and promise is beginning to beam brightly over the long-obscured horizon of the South, and we are firm in the belief that freedom, wealth, and magnanimity will soon do justice to the memory of those fearless patriots whose fair fame has been suffered to molder amidst the multifarious abominations of slavery, poverty, ignorance, and groveling selfishness. Judge Iredell's testimony, which will be found on a preceding page, and to which we request the reader to recur, might have been appropriately introduced under our present heading. At the provincial convention held in North Carolina in August 1774, in which there were 69 delegates representing nearly every county in the province, it was resolved that we will not import any slave or slaves, or purchase any slave or slaves imported or brought into the province by others from any part of the world after the first day of November next. In Iredell's statutes, revised by Martin, it is stated that in North Carolina, no general law at all was passed prior to the Revolution declaring who might be slaves. That there is no legal slavery in the southern states, and that slavery nowhere can be legalized any more than theft, arson, or murder can be legalized, has been virtually admitted by some of the most profound southern jurists themselves, and we will here digress so far as to furnish the testimony of one or two eminent lawyers, not of North Carolina, upon this point. In the debate in the United States Senate in 1850 on the Fugitive Slave Bill, Mr. Mason of Virginia objected to Mr. Dayton's amendment providing for a trial by jury because, said he, a trial by jury necessarily carries with it a trial of the whole right, and a trial of the right to service will be gone into according to all the forms of the court is determining upon any other fact. Then again, it is proposed as part of the proof to be adduced at the hearing after the fugitive has been recaptured that evidence shall be brought by the claimant to show that slavery is established in the state from which the fugitive has absconded. Now this very thing, in a recent case in the city of New York, was required by one of the judges of that state, which case attracted the attention of the authorities of Maryland and against which they protested. In that case, the state judge went so far as to say that the only mode of proving it was by reference to the statute books. Such proof is required in the senator's amendment, and if he means by this that proof shall be brought that slavery is established by existing laws, it is impossible to comply with that requisition, for no such law can be produced, I apprehend, in any of the slave states. I am not aware that there is a single state in which the institution is established by positive law. Judge Clark of Mississippi says, in this state the legislature have considered slaves as a reasonable and accountable being, and it would be a stigma upon the character of the state and a reproach to the administration of justice if the life of a slave could be taken with impunity, or if he could be murdered in cold blood without subjecting the offender to the highest penalty known to the criminal jurisprudence of the country. Has the slave no rights because he is deprived of his freedom? He is still a human being and possesses all those rights of which he is not deprived by the positive provisions of the law. The rights of the master exist not by force of the law of nature or nations, but by virtue only of the positive laws of the state. The Honorable Judge Ruffin of North Carolina says, Arguments drawn from the well-established principles which confer and restrain the authority of the parent over the child, the tutor over the pupil, the master over the apprentice, have been pressed on us. The court does not recognize their application. There is no likeness between the cases. They are in opposition to each other, and there is an impassable gulf between them. The difference is that which exists between freedom and slavery, and a greater cannot be imagined. In the one, the end in view is the happiness of the youth, born to equal rights with that governor on whom the duty devolves of training the young to usefulness in a station which he is afterwards to assume among freemen. To such an end, and with such a subject, moral and intellectual instruction seem to the natural means, and the most part they are found to suffice. Moderate force is superadded only to make the others effectual. If that fail, it is better to leave the party to his own headstrong passions and the ultimate correction of the law than to allow it to be immoderately inflicted by a private person. With slavery, it is far otherwise. The end is the profit of the master, his security, and the public safety. The subject, one doomed in his own person and his posterity to live without knowledge and without the capacity to make anything his own, and to toil that another may reap the fruits. What moral considerations shall be addressed to such a being to convince him what it is impossible, but that the most stupid must feel and know can never be true, that he is thus to labor upon a principle of natural duty, or for the sake of his own personal happiness? Such services can only be expected from one who has no will of his own, who surrenders his will in implicit obedience to that of another. Such obedience is the consequence only of uncontrolled authority over the body. There is nothing else which can operate to produce the effect. The power of the master must be absolute to render the submission of the slave perfect. I must freely confess my sense of the harshness of this proposition. I feel it as deeply as any man can, and as a principle of moral right, every person in his retirement must repudiate it. An esteemed friend, a physician who was born and bred in Rowan County, North Carolina, and who now resides there, informs us that Judge Gaston, who was one of the half-dozen statesmen whom the South has produced since the days of the venerable fathers of the Republic, was an avowed abolitionist, and that he published an address to the people of North Carolina delineating in a masterly manner the material, moral, and social disadvantages of slavery. Where is that address? Has it been suppressed by the oligarchy? The fact that slaveholders have from time to time made strenuous efforts to expunge the sentiments of freedom which now adorn the works of nobler men than the noble Gaston may perhaps fully account for the oblivious state into which his patriotic address seems to have fallen. The voice of South Carolina. Poor South Carolina, folly is her nightcap. Fanaticism is her daydream. Fire-eating is her pastime. She has lost her better judgment. The dictates of reason and philosophy have no influence upon her actions. Like the wife who is pitiably infatuated with a drunken, worthless husband, she still clings with unabated love to the cause of her shame, her misery, and her degradation. A Kentuckian has recently expressed his opinion of the state in the following language: South Carolina is bringing herself irrevocably to the public contempt. It is impossible for any impartial lover of his country, for any just-thinking man, to witness her senseless and quenchless malignancy against the Union without the most immeasurable disgust and scorn. She is one vast hotbed of disunion. Her people think and talk of nothing else. She is a festering mass of treason. In 1854, there were assessed for taxation in South Carolina acres of land, 17,289,359, valued at $22,836,374. Average value per acre, $1.32. At the same time, in New Jersey, acres of land, 5,324,800, valued at $153,161,619. Average value per acre, $28.76 per acre. We hope the slavocrats will look first on that picture and then on this one, from one to the other, or both, that they may glean a ray or two of wisdom, which, if duly applied, will be of incalculable advantage to them and their posterity. We trust also that the non-slave-holding whites will view with discriminating minds the different lights and shades of these two pictures. They are the parties most deeply interested, and it is to them we look for glorious revolution. That is, to substitute freedom for slavery. They have the power to retrieve the fallen fortunes of South Carolina, to raise her up from the loathsome snake of iniquity in which slavery has plunged her, and to make her one of the more brilliant stars in the great constellation of states. While their minds are occupied with other considerations, let them not forget the difference between $28.76, the value of land per acre in New Jersey, which is a second-rate free state, and $1.32 per acre, the value of land in South Carolina, which is par excellence the model slave state. The difference between the two sums is $27.44, which would amount to precisely $2,744 on every 100 acres. To present the subject in another form, the South Carolina tract of land containing 200 acres is worth now only $264 and is depreciating every day. Let slavery be abolished, and in the course of a few years the same tract will be worth $5,752 with an upward tendency. At this rate, the increment of value on the total area of the state will amount to more than 3 times as much as the present estimated value of the slaves. South Carolina has not always been, nor will she always continue to be, on the wrong side. From Ramsay's History of the State, we learned that in 1774 she resolved that His Majesty's subjects in North America, without respect to color or other accidents, are entitled to all the inherent rights and liberties of his natural-born subjects within the kingdom of Great Britain, that it is their fundamental right that no man should suffer in his person or property without a fair trial and judgment given by his peers or by the law of the land. One of our early writers, under the nom de plume of Philodemus, in a political pamphlet published in Charleston in 1784, declares that such is the fatal influence of slavery on the human mind, that it almost wholly effaces from it even the boasted characteristic of rationality. The same writer, speaking on the particular interests of South Carolina, says, "It has been too common with us to search for records of other nations to find precedents that may give sanction to our own errors and lead us unwarily into confusion and ruin. It is our business to consult their histories, not with a view to tread right or wrong in their steps, but in order to investigate the real sources of mischiefs that have befallen them, and to endeavor to escape the rocks which they have all unfortunately split upon. It is paying ourselves but a poor compliment to say that we are incapable of profiting by others, and that with all the information which is to be derived from their fatal experience, it is in vain for us to attempt to excel them. If with all the peculiar advantages of our present situation we are incapable of surpassing our predecessors, we must be a degenerate race indeed, and quite unworthy of those singular bounties of heaven which we are so unskilled or undesirous to turn to our benefit. A recent number of Fraser's Magazine contains a well-timed and well-written article from the pen of William Henry Hobart of this state, and from it we make the following extract. As all sagacious observers of the operation of the system of slavery has demonstrated, the profitable employment of slave labor is inconsistent with the development of agricultural science and demands a continual supply of new and unexhausted soil. The slaveholder, investing his capital in the purchases of laborers themselves and not merely in soil and machines, paying his free laborers out of the profit, must depend for his continued and progressive prosperity upon the cheapness and facility with which he can transfer his slaves to fresh and fertile lands. An enormous additional item, namely, the price of slaves, being added to the cost of production, all other elements of that cost require to be proportionably smaller, or the profits fail." In an address delivered before the South Carolina Institute in Charleston, November 20th, 1856, Mr. B.F. Perry of Greenville truthfully says, It has been South Carolina's misfortune in this utilitarian age to have her greatest talents and most powerful energies directed to pursuits which avail her nothing in the way of wealth and prosperity. In the first settlement of a new country, agricultural industry necessarily absorbs all the time and occupation of its inhabitants. They must clear the forests and cultivate the earth in order to make their bread. This is their first consideration. Then the mechanical arts and manufactures and commerce must follow in the footsteps of agriculture to ensure either individual or national prosperity. No people can be highly prosperous without them. No people have ever been. Agriculture alone will not make or sustain a great people. The true policy of every people is to cultivate the earth, manufacture its products, and sell them abroad in exchange for those comforts and luxuries and necessaries which their own country and their own industry cannot give or make. The dependence of South Carolina on Europe and on the northern states for all the necessaries, comforts, and luxuries which the mechanic arts can afford has in fact drained her of her wealth and made her positively poor when compared with the sister states of the Confederacy. It is at once mortifying and alarming to see and reflect on our own dependence in the mechanic arts and manufacturers on strangers and foreigners. In the northern states, their highest talents and energy have been diversified and more profitably employed in developing the resources of the country and making new inventions in the mechanic arts and enriching the community with science and literature, commerce, and manufactures. The voice of Georgia. Of the states strictly southern, Georgia is perhaps the most thrifty. The prosperous condition of the state is mainly ascribed to her 100,000 free white laborers, more than 83,000 of whom are engaged in agricultural pursuits. In few other slave states are non-slaveholders so little under the domination of the oligarchy. At best, however, even in the most liberal slave states, the social position of the non-slaveholding whites is but one short step in advance of that of the Negroes. And as there is, on the part of the oligarchy, a constantly increasing desire and effort to usurp greater power, the more we investigate the subject, the more fully are we convinced that nothing but the speedy and utter annihilation of slavery from the entire nation can save the masses of white people in the southern states from ultimately falling to a political level with the blacks, both occupying the most abject and galling condition of servitude of which it is possible for the human mind to conceive. Now, at the same time, Helper is writing this, a man named George Fitzhugh, who had written his first book, Sociology for the South, or The Failure of a Free Society, in 1854, and was getting ready to put out in the same year Helper put this book out, Cannibals All, or Slaves Without Masters. Now, Fitzhugh was an amazing defender of the slavery system because he actually said that slavery was the pure expression of socialism. And he also said that he argued for the benefit of slavery in general, even in fact enslaving white people as well. In other words, the idea that poor whites should be sold into slavery as well, though he did say that he thought that the blacks were better suited for slavery. He did argue for universal slavery, which made George Fitzhugh very controversial in the whole nation, even in the South. So it's a very complicated thing. When you see what Helper's writing here, he's actually, I think, in some ways, writing that statement he just made about servitude of the whites in a response a little bit to Fitzhugh. Back to the book. General Oglethorpe, under whose management the colony of Georgia was settled in 1733, was bitterly opposed to the institution of slavery. In a letter to Granville Sharp, dated October 13, 1776, he says, "My friends and I settled the colony of Georgia and by charter were established trustees to make laws, etc. We determined not to suffer slavery there, but the slave merchants and their adherents occasioned us not only much trouble, but at last got the government to favor them. We would not suffer slavery, which is against the gospel as well as the fundamental law of England, to be authorized Under our authority, we refused as trustees to make a law permitting such a horrid crime. The government, finding the trustees resolved firmly not to concur with what they believed unjust, took away the charter by which no law could be passed without our consent. On the 12th of January, 1775, in endorsing the proceedings of the First American Congress, among other resolutions, the representatives of the extensive District of Darien in the colony of Georgia adopted the following: to show the world that we are not influenced by any contracted or interested motives, but a general philanthropy for all mankind of whatever climate, language, or complexion, we hereby declare our disapprobation and abhorrence of the unnatural practice of slavery in America, however the uncultivated state of our country or other spacious arguments may plead for it, a practice founded in injustice and cruelty and highly dangerous to our liberties as well as lives, debasing part of our fellow creatures below men, and corrupting the virtues and morals of the rest, and is laying the basis of that liberty we contend for, and which we pray the Almighty to continue to the last posterity upon a very wrong foundation. We therefore resolve at all times to use our utmost endeavors for the manumission or freedom of our slaves in the colony upon the most safe and equitable footing for the masters and themselves. The Honorable Mr. Reed of the state of Georgia, in a speech delivered in Congress February 1st, 1820, says, I am not the panegyrist of slavery. It is an unnatural state, a dark cloud which obscures half the luster of our free institutions. For my own part, though, surrounded by slavery from my cradle to the present moment, yet I hate the touch of servile hands. I loathe the slaves who cringe around. As an accompaniment to those lines, he might have uttered these: I would not have a slave to till my ground, to carry me, to fan me while I sleep, and tremble when I wake, for all the wealth that sinews bought and sold have ever earned. Thus have we presented a comprehensive summary of the most unequivocal and irrefragable testimony of the South against the iniquitous institution of human slavery. What more can we say? What more can we do? We might fill a folio volume with similar extracts, but we must forego the task. The remainder of our space must be occupied with other arguments. In the foregoing excerpts is revealed to us a language too plain to be misunderstood. The important fact that every truly great and good man the South has ever produced has, with hopeful confidence, looked forward to the time when this entire continent shall be redeemed from the crime and the curse of slavery. Our noble, self-sacrificing forefathers have performed their part, and performed it well. They have laid us a foundation as enduring as the earth itself. In their dying moments, they admonished us to carry out their designs in upbuilding and completion of the superstructure. Let us obey their patriotic injunctions. From each of the 6 original Southern states, we have introduced the most ardent aspirations for liberty, the most positive condemnations of slavery. From each of the 9 slave states, which have been admitted into the Union since the organization of the general government, we could introduce from several of their wisest and best citizens anti-slavery sentiment equally as strong and convincing as those that emanated from the great founders of our movement, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Patrick Henry, and the Randolphs. As we have already remarked, however, the limits of this chapter will not admit of the introduction of additional testimony from either of the old or of the new slave states. The reader will not fail to observe that in presenting these solid abolition doctrines of the South, we have been careful to make such quotations as triumphantly refute in every particular the more specious sophistries of the oligarchy. The mention of these illustrious names above reminds us of the fact that the party newspapers, whose venal columns are eternally teeming with vituperation and slander, have long assured us that the Whig ship was to be steered by the Washington rudder, that the Democratic bark was to sail with the Jefferson compass, and that the Know-Nothing brig was to carry the Madison chart. Imposed upon by these monstrous falsehoods, we have from time to time been induced to engage passage on each of these corrupt and rickety old hulks, but in every instance We have been basely swamped in the sea of slavery and are alone indebted for our lives to the kindness of heaven and the art of swimming. Washington, the founder of the Whig Party. Jefferson, the founder of the Democratic Party. Voltaire, the founder of Christianity. God forbid that man's heart should always continue to be the citadel of deception, that he should ever be to the others the antipode of what he is to himself. He's just giving examples of what he finds to be absolutely ridiculous, and it is. There is now in this country but one party that promises in good faith to put into practice the principles of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and the other venerable fathers of the Republic, the Republican Party. To this party we pledge unswerving allegiance as long as it shall continue to pursue the statism advocated by the great political prototypes above mentioned, but no longer. We believe it is, as it ought to be, the desire, determination, and the destiny of this party to give the death blow to slavery should future developments prove the party at variance with this belief, a belief, by the by, which it has recently inspired in the breasts of little less than 1.5 million of the most intelligent and patriotic voters in America. We shall shake off the dust of our feet against it and join one that will, in a summary manner, extirpate the intolerable grievance. And that is the end of Chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Impending Crisis of the South, How to Meet It, by Hinton Helper, published 1857. Chapter 4, Northern Testimony. The best evidence that can be given of the enlightened patriotism and love of liberty in the free states is the fact that at the presidential election in 1856 they polled 1,300,000 votes for the Republican candidate John C. Fremont. Ironically, John C. Fremont was Southern-born as well as Lincoln, which is kind of amazing that the first two Republican candidates for president were both originally born in the South. The fact of itself seems to preclude the necessity of strengthening our cause with the individual testimony of even their greatest men. Having, however, adduced the most cogent and conclusive anti-slavery arguments from the Washingtons, Jeffersons, the Madisons, the Randolphs, and the Clays of the South, we shall proceed to enrich our pages with the gems of liberty from the Franklins, the Hamiltons, the Jays, the Adamses, and the Websters of the North. Too close attention cannot be paid to the words of wisdom which we have extracted from the works of these truly eminent and philosophic statesmen. We will first listen to the voice of Franklin. Dr. Franklin was the first president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and it is now generally conceded that this was the first regularly organized American abolition society. It having been formed as early as 1774, while we were yet subjects of the British government. In 1790, in the name and on the behalf of this society, Dr. Franklin, who was then within a few months of the close of his life, drafted a memorial to the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States in which he said, "Your memorialists, particularly engaged in attending to the distresses arising from slavery, believe it to be their indispensable duty to present this subject to your notice. They have observed with real satisfaction that many important and salutary powers are vested in you for promoting the welfare and securing the blessings of liberty to the people of the United States, and as they conceive that these blessings ought rightfully to be administered without the distinction of color to all descriptions of people, so they indulge themselves in the pleasing expectations that nothing which can be done for the relief of the unhappy objects of their care, which will either be omitted or delayed. From a persuasion that equal liberty was originally the portion and is still the birthright of all men, and influenced by the strong ties of humanity and the principles of their institution, your memorialists conceive themselves bound to use all justifiable endeavors to loosen the bonds of slavery and to promote a general enjoyment of the blessings of freedom. Under these impressions, they earnestly entreat your attention to the subject of slavery, that you will be pleased to countenance the restoration of liberty of those unhappy men who alone in this land of freedom are degraded into perpetual bondage, and who, amid the general joy of surrounding freemen, are groaning in servile subjection. That you will devise means for removing this inconsistency of character from the American people, that you will promote mercy and justice toward the distressed race, and that you will step to the very verge of power vested in you for discouraging every species of traffic in the persons of our fellow men. On another occasion, he says slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature. Now, as you see, at this time, the understanding of human races was a bit different, and they believed in the philosophical liberty at this time, though, as we will see later on, that the understanding of human races, which began to come in with Blumenbach in 1779, we'll see things a little differently. The voice of Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant statesman and financier, tells us that the sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. Again, in 1774, addressing himself to an American Tory, he says, "The fundamental source of all your errors, sophisms, and false reasoning is a total ignorance of the natural rights of mankind. Were you once to become acquainted with these, you could never entertain a thought that all men are not by nature entitled to equal privileges. You would be convinced that natural liberty is the gift of the beneficent Creator to the whole human race, and that civil liberty is founded on that." The voice of Jay. John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States under the Constitution of 1789, in a letter to the Honorable Elias Boudinot, dated November 17, 1819, says, Little can be added to what has been said and written on the subject of slavery. I concur in the opinion that it ought not to be introduced nor permitted in any of the new states, and that it ought to be gradually diminished and finally abolished in all of them. To me, the constitutional authority of Congress to prohibit the migration and importation of slaves into any of the states does not appear questionable. The first article of the Constitution specifies the legislative powers committed to the Congress. The ninth section of that article has these words: "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the now existing states shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person." I understand the sense and meaning of this clause to be that the power of Congress, although competent to prohibit such migration and importation, was to be exercised with respect to the then existing states, and them only until the year 1808, but the Congress were at liberty to make such prohibitions as to any new state which might in the meantime be established, and further, that from and after that period they were authorized to make such prohibitions as to all the states, whether new or old. It will, I presume, be admitted that slaves were the persons intended. The word slaves is avoided probably on account of the existing toleration of slavery and its discordancy with the principles of the Revolution, and from a consciousness of it being repugnant to the following positions in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In a previous letter written from Spain, whither he had been appointed as minister plenipotentiary, he says, speaking of the abolition of slavery, "Till America comes into this measure, her prayers to heaven will be impious. This is a strong expression, but it is just. I believe that God governs the world, and I believe it to be a maxim in his, as in our courts, that those who ask for equity ought to do it." William J. The Honorable William J., a noble son of the Chief Justice John J., says, "A crisis has arrived in which we must maintain our rights or surrender them forever. I speak not to abolitionists alone, but to all who value the liberty our fathers achieved. Do you ask what we have to do with slavery? Let our muzzled presses answer. Let the mobs excited against us by the merchants and politicians answer. Let the gag laws threatened by our governors and legislatures answer. Let the conduct of the national government answer." The voice of Adams. From the diary of John Quincy Adams, the old man eloquent, we make the following extract. It is among the evils of slavery that it taints the very sources of moral principle. It establishes false estimates of virtue and vice, for what can be more false and more heartless than this doctrine which makes the first and holiest rights of humanity to depend upon the color of skin? It perverts human reasoning and induces men endowed with logical powers to maintain that slavery is sanctioned by the Christian religion, that slaves are happy and contented in their condition, that between master and slave there are ties of mutual attachment and affection, that the virtues of the master are refined and exalted by the degradation of the slaves, while at the same time they vent execrations upon the slave trade, curse Britain for having given them the slaves, burn at the stake Negroes convicted of crimes for the terror of the example, and writhe in agonies of fear at the very mention of human rights as applicable to the men of color. The voice of Webster, in a speech which he delivered at Niblo's Garden in the city of New York on the 15th of March, 1847, Daniel Webster, the great expounder of the Constitution, said, "On the general question of slavery, a great part of the community is already strongly excited. The subject has not only attracted attention as a question of politics, but it has struck a far deeper one ahead. It has arrested the religious feeling of the country. It has taken strong hold on the consciences of men. He is a rash man indeed, and little conversant with human nature, and especially has an erroneous estimate of the character of people of this country, who supposes that a feeling of this kind is to be trifled with or despised. It will assuredly cause itself to be respected, but to endeavor to coin it into silver, or to retain its free expression, to seek to compress and confine it, warm as it is, and more heated as such endeavors would inevitably render it, should this be attempted. I know nothing, even in the Constitution of the Union itself, which might not be endangered by the explosion which might follow." When discussing the Oregon Bill in 1848, he said, "I have made up my mind, for one, that under no circumstances will I consent to the further extension of the area of slavery in the United States, or to the further increase of slave representation in the House of Representatives." Under the date of February 15, 1850, in a letter to the Reverend Mr. Furness, he says, "From my earliest youth I have regarded slavery as a great moral and political evil. I think it unjust, repugnant to the natural equality of mankind, founded only in a superior power, a standing and permanent conquest by the stronger over the weaker. All pretense of defending it on the ground of different races I have ever condemned. I have said that if the black race is weaker, that is a reason against it, not for it. Subjugation and oppression. In a religious point of view, I have ever regarded it, and even spoken of it, not as subject to any express denunciation either in the Old Testament or the New, but as opposed to the whole spirit of the gospel and to the teachings of Jesus Christ. The religion of Jesus Christ is a religion of kindness, justice, and brotherly love. But slavery is not kindly affection. It does not seek another's and not its own, does not let the oppressed go free. It is, as I have said it, but a continual act of oppression. But then, such is the influence of a habit of thinking among men, and such is the influence of what has been long established, that even minds religious and tenderly conscientious, such as would be shocked by any single act of oppression, in any single exercise of violence and unjust power, are not always moved by the reflection that slavery is a continual and permanent violation of human rights. While delivering a speech at Buffalo in the state of New York in the summer of 1851, only about 12 months prior to his death, he made use of the following emphatic words: "I never would consent, and never have consented, that there should be 1 foot of slave territory beyond what the old 13 states had at the formation of the Union. Never, never." Noah Webster. Noah Webster, the great American vocabulist, said that freedom is the sacred right of every man, whatever be his color, who has not forfeited by some violation of municipal laws a truth established by God himself in the very creation of human beings. No time, no circumstance, no human power or policy can change the nature of this truth, nor repeal the fundamental laws of society by which every man's right to liberty is guarded. The act of enslaving men is always a violation of those great primary laws of society by which alone the master himself holds every particle of his own freedom. The voice of Clinton. DeWitt Clinton, the father of the great system of internal improvements in the state of New York, speaking of the despotism in Europe and of slavery in America, asks, have not prescriptions and precedent, patriarchal dominion, divine right of kings and masters, been alternately called into sanction the slavery of nations, and would not all the despotisms of the ancient and modern world have vanished into air if the natural equality of mankind had been properly understood and practiced? This declares that the same measure of justice ought to be measured out to all men without regard to adventurous inequalities and the intellectual and physical disparities which proceed from inexplicable causes. The voice of Warren. Major General Joseph Warren, one of the truest patriots of the Revolution and the first American officer of rank that fell in our contest with Great Britain, says that personal freedom is the natural right of every man, and that property, or an exclusive right to dispose of what he has honestly acquired by his own labor, necessarily arises therefrom, are truths that common sense has placed beyond the reach of contradiction. And no man or body of men can, without being guilty of flagrant injustice, claim a right to dispose of the persons of acquisition of any other man or body of men, unless it can be proved that such a right has arisen from some compact between the parties in which it has been explicitly and freely granted. Otis, Hancock, Ames, and others should be heard but for want of space. Volumes upon volumes might be filled with extracts similar to the above from the works of the deceased statesmen and sages of the North, who, while living, proved themselves equal to the task of exterminating from their own states the matchless curse of human slavery. Such are the men who, though no longer with us in the flesh, still live. A living principle and immortal interest have they invested in every great and good work that distinguishes the free states, the railroads, the canals, the telegraphs, the factories, the fleets of merchant vessels, the magnificent cities, the scientific modes of agriculture, the unrivaled institutions of learning, and other striking evidences of progress and improvement, as the North are, either directly or indirectly, the offspring of their gigantic intellects. When, if ever, commerce and manufactures and liberty and great enterprises and truth and liberty and justice and magnanimity shall have become obsolete terms, that then their names may possibly be forgotten, but not till then. An army of brave and worthy successors, champions of freedom now living, have the illustrious forefathers of the North in the persons of Garrison, Greeley, Giddings, Goodell, Grow, Garrett Smith, Seward, Sumner, Stowe, Raymond, Parker, and Phillips, in Beecher, Banks, Burlingame, Bryant, Hale, and Hildreth, in Emerson, Dayton, Thompson, Tappan, King, and Cheever, in Whittier, Wade, Wayland, Weed, and Burleigh. These are the men whom, in connection with their learned and eloquent compatriots, the Everetts, the Bancrofts, the Prescotts, the Chapins, the Longfellows, and the Danas, future historians, if faithful to their calling, will place on record as America's true statesmen, literati, preachers, philosophers, and philanthropists of the present ages. In connection, however, it may not be amiss to remark that the Homers, Platos, the Bacons, the Newtons, the Shakespeares, the Miltons, Blackstones, the Cuviers, the Humboldts, and Macaulays of America have not yet produced, nor in our humble judgment will they be, until slavery shall be overthrown and freedom established in the states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Upon the soil of those states, when free, or on other free soil crossed by about the same degrees of latitude and not distant from the Appalachian chain of mountains, will we believe be nurtured into manhood in the course of 1 or 2 centuries, perhaps as great men as those mentioned above, greater possibly than any that have ever lived. Whence their ancestors may have come from, whether Europe, Asia, Africa, Oceania, North or South America, or from the islands of the sea, or whatever honorable vocation they may now be engaged in, matters nothing at all, for aught we know that their great-grandfathers are now humble artisans in Maine, or moneyed merchants in Massachusetts, illiterate poor whites in Mississippi, or slave-driving lordlings in South Carolina, frugal farmers in Michigan, or millionaires in Illinois, daring hunters in the Rocky Mountains or metal diggers in California, peasants in France or princes in Germany, no matter where or what the scope of country above mentioned is, in our opinion, destined to be the birthplace of their illustrious offspring, the great savants of the New World, concerning whom we should console ourselves with the hope that they are not buried deeply in the matrix of the future. That is the end of Chapter 4, The Northern Testimony. Chapter 5, Testimony of the Nations. To the true friends of freedom throughout the world, it is a pleasing thought, and one which, by being communicated to others, is well calculated to universalize the principles of liberty, that the great heroes, statesmen, and sages of all ages and nations, ancient and modern, who have ever had occasion to speak of the institution of human slavery, have entered their most unequivocal and positive protests against it. To say that they disapproved of the system would not be sufficiently expressive of the utter detestation with which they uniformly regarded it, that they abhorred it as the vilest invention that the evil one has ever assisted bad men to concoct, is quite evident from the very tone and construction of their language. Having, with much pleasure and profit, heard the testimony of America through her representative men, we will now hear that of other nations through their representative men, doubting not that we shall be more than remunerated for our time and trouble. We will first listen to the voice of England. In the case of James Somerset, a Negro who had been kidnapped in Africa, transported to Virginia, there sold into slavery, thence carried to England as a waiting boy, and there induced to institute proceedings against his master for the recovery of its freedom. Lord Mansfield says, the state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself whence it was created is erased from memory. It is so odious that nothing can be sufficient to support it but positive law. Whatever inconveniences, therefore, may follow from the decision, I cannot say this case is allowed or approved by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. Now, a lot of people don't know. Lord Mansfield's Somerset case was one of the cases that helped cause the American Revolution, though it's never mentioned in books. It was a book where basically the government of Great Britain said they had the right to emancipate slaves anytime they want, but most people do not know that Lord Mansfield, and you can look up the picture of her, you can look up the name Dido Elizabeth Bell. Lord Mansfield had a mulatto niece. Dido Elizabeth Bell's father was Sir John Lindsay. He was a British sailor and supposedly had encountered her mother on board a Spanish ship that they had captured in the Caribbean. And soon afterwards, the girl got pregnant and she was born, and then he had taken her briefly to British Florida, but then he had decided, because he figured if she stayed in the New World, because of the law of partus sequitur ventrum, which is called law of the womb, that any child born to a slave would be a slave, he said that he would send her immediately to his uncle, Lord Mansfield. Lord Mansfield was one of the most famous legal minds in Britain before the American Revolution. And so Lord Mansfield was obviously, when he wrote this decision, was obviously very concerned with the issue of slavery for a very personal reason. Now let's get back to the book here. John Locke says, slavery is so vile, so miserable a state of man, and so directly opposite to the generous temper and courage of our nation, that it is hard to be conceived that an Englishman, much less a gentleman, should plead for it. Again he says, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself. William Pitt says, it is injustice to permit slavery to remain for a single hour. Legendary British politician Charles James Fox, who served during the American Revolution and French Revolution in the English Parliament, and was also a very devout supporter of the American Revolution, said, with regard to a regulation of slavery, my detestation of the existence induces me to know No such thing as a regulation of robbery and a restriction of murder. Personal freedom is a right of which he who deprives a fellow creature is criminal in so depriving him, and he who withholds is no less a criminal than withholding. Shakespeare says, a man is master of his liberty. Again he said, it is the curse of kings to be attended by slaves that take their humors for a warrant to break within the bloody house of life, and on the winkling of authority to understand a law to know the meaning of dangerous majesty when perchance it frowns more upon humor than advised respect, and heaven will one day free us from this slavery. Again, liberty, freedom, tyranny is dead. Run hence, proclaim. Cry about it in the streets. Some to the common pulpits and cry out, liberty, freedom, and enfranchisement. Cowper says, slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, at that moment they are free. They touch our country and their shackles fall. That's noble and bespeaks a nation proud and jealous of the blessing. Spread it then, and let it circulate through every vein of all your empire. That's where Britain's power is felt. Mankind may feel her mercy too. Milton says, where is the beauty to see, like the sun-brilliant brow of a nation when free? Again he says, if our fathers promised for themselves to make themselves slaves, they could make no promise for us. Again, since therefore the law is chiefly right reason, if we are bound to obey a magistrate as a minister of God by the very same reason and the very same law, we ought to resist a tyrant and minister of the devil. Dr. Johnson said, no man is by nature the property of another. The rights of nature must be some way forfeited before they can be justly taken away again. Dr. Price says, if you have a right to make another man a slave, he has the right to make you a slave. Blackstone says, if neither captivity nor contract can, by the plain law of nature and reason, reduce the parent to a state of slavery, much less can they reduce the offspring. Again, Blackstone says, the primary aim of society is to protect the individuals in the enjoyment of those absolute rights which were vested in them by the immutable laws of nature. Hence it follows that the first and primary end of human laws is to maintain those absolute rights of individuals. Again, if any human law shall allow or require us to commit crime, we are bound to transgress that human law, or else we must offend both the natural and divine. Coke says, what the Parliament doth shall be holden for naught whenever it shall enact that which is contrary to the rights of nature. Hampden says, the essence of all law is justice. What is not justice is not law, and what is not law ought not to be obeyed. Harrington said, all men naturally are equal, for though nature with a noble variety has made different features and lineaments of men, yet as to freedom she has made every one alike and given the same desires. Fortescue says, those rights which God, nature, have established, and which are therefore called rights, such as life and liberty, need not the aid of human law be more effectually invested in every man than they are, neither do they receive any additional strength when declared by the municipal laws to be inviolable. On the contrary, no human power has any authority to abridge or destroy them, unless the owner himself shall commit some act that amounts to a forfeiture. Again he says, the law, therefore, which supports slavery and opposes liberty, must necessarily be condemned as cruel, for every feeling of human nature advocates liberty. Slavery is introduced by human wickedness, but God advocates liberty by the nature which he has given to man. Brougham says, tell me not of rights, talk not of the property of the planter in his slaves. I deny that right. I acknowledge not the property. In vain you tell me of laws that sanction such a claim. There is a law above all the enactments of human ones, the same throughout the world, the same in all times. It is the law written by the finger of God on the hearts of men, and by that law unchangeable and eternal, while men despise fraud and loathe rapine, and abhor blood, they shall reject with indignation the wild and guilty fantasy that man can hold property in another man. The Voice of Ireland, Burke says, slavery is a state so improper, so degrading, and so ruinous to the feelings and capacities of human nature that it ought not to be suffered to exist. Curran said, I speak in the spirit of British law, which makes liberty commensurate with and inseparable from British soil, which proclaims even to the stranger and sojourner the moment he sets his foot upon British earth that the ground on which he treads is holy and consecrated by the genius of universal emancipation. No matter in what language his doom may have been pronounced, no matter what complexion incompatible with freedom an Indian or an African sun may have burned upon him, no matter in what disastrous battle his liberty may have been cloven down, no matter with what solemnities he may have been devoted upon the altar of slavery, the moment he touches the sacred soil of Britain, the altar and the gods sink together in the dust. His soul walks abroad in her own majesty, and he stands redeemed, regenerated, and disenthralled by the irresistible genius of universal emancipation. The Dublin University Magazine for December 1856 says, the United States must learn from the examples of Rome that Christianity and the pagan institution of slavery cannot coexist together. The Republic must take her side and choose her favorite child, for if she loved the one, she must hate the other. The Voice of Scotland, Biddy says, slavery is inconsistent with the dearest and most essential rights of man's nature. It is detrimental to the virtue and industry. It hardens the heart to those tender sympathies which forms the most lovely part of human character. It involves the innocent in hopeless misery in order to procure wealth and pleasure for the authors of that misery. It seeks to degrade into brutes beings whom the Lord of heaven endowed with rational souls and created for immortality. In short, it is utterly repugnant to every principle of reason, religion, humanity, and conscience. It is impossible for a considerate and unprejudiced mind to think of slavery without horror. Miller says, the human mind revolts at a serious discussion of the subject of slavery. Every individual, whatever his country or complexion, is entitled to freedom. Macknight says, men stealers are inserted among the daring criminals against whom the law of God directed its awful curse. They were persons who kidnapped men to sell them for slaves, and this practice seems inseparable from the other iniquities and impressions of slavery. Nor can a slave dealer easily keep free from this criminality, if indeed the receiver is as bad as the thief. The Voice of France, Lafayette said, I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery. Again, while in the prison of Magdeburg, he said, I know not what disposition has made of my plantation at Cayenne, but I hope Madame de Lafayette will take care that the Negroes who cultivate it shall preserve their liberty. O. Lafayette, grandson of General Lafayette, in a letter under the date April 26, 1851, says, the great question of the abolition of Negro slavery, which has my entire sympathy, appears to me to have established its importance throughout the world. At the present time, the states of the peninsula, if I do not deceive myself, are the only European powers who still continue to possess slaves, and America, while continuing to uphold slavery, feels daily more and more how heavily it weighs upon her destinies. Montesquieu says, what civil law can restrain a slave from running away since he is not a member of society? Again, he says, slavery is contrary to the fundamental principles of all societies. Again, in democracies where they are all upon equality, slavery is contrary to the principles of the Constitution. Again, nothing puts one nearer to the condition of a brute than always to see freemen and not be free. Again, even the earth itself, which teems with profusion under the cultivating hand of free-born labor, shrinks into barrenness from the contaminating sweat of a slave. Louis X issued the following edict, all men are by nature free-born, and as this kingdom is called the kingdom of the Franks, freemen, it shall be so in reality. It is therefore decreed that enfranchisement shall be granted throughout the whole kingdom upon just and reasonable terms. Buffon says, it is apparent that the unfortunate Negroes are endowed with excellent hearts and possess the seeds of every human virtue. I cannot write their history without lamenting their miserable condition. Humanity revolts at those odious oppressions that result from avarice. Rousseau says the terms slavery and right contradict and exclude each other. Rousseau says slavery in all its forms and all degrees is a violation of divine law and a degradation of human nature. The Voice of Germany. Grotius says, those are men stealers who abduct, keep, sell, or buy slaves or free men. To steal a man is the highest kind of theft. Goethe says, such busy multitudes I fain would see stand upon free soil with a people free. Martin Luther says, unjust violence is by no means the ordinance of God, and therefore combine no one in conscience and right to obey, whether the command comes from the Pope, Emperor, King, or Master. An able German writer of the present day says in a recent letter to his friends in this country, consider that the cause of American liberty is the cause of universal liberty. Its failure a triumph of despotism everywhere. Remember that while American liberty is the great argument of European democracy, American slavery is the greater argument of its despotism. Remember that all our actions should be governed by the golden rule, whether individual, social, or political, and no government, and above all no Republican government, is safe in the hands of men that practically deny that rule. Will you support by your vote a system that recognizes property of man in man, a system which sanctions the sale of the child by its own father? Regardless of the purpose of the buyer, what need is there to present to you the unmitigated wrong of slavery? It is the shame of our age that argument is needed against slavery. Liberty is no exclusive property. It is the property of mankind of all ages. She is immortal, though crushed, can never die, though banished. She will return. Though fettered, she will yet be free. The Voice of Italy. Cicero says, by the grand laws of nature, all men are born free, and this law is universally binding upon all men. Again, he says, eternal justice is the basis of all human laws. Again, law is not something wrought out by man's ingenuity, nor is it a decree of the people, but is something eternal governing the world by the wisdom of its commands and prohibitions. Again, whatever is just is also true law, nor can this true law be abrogated by any written enactments. Again, if there be such a power in the decrees and commands of fools that the nature of things is changed by their votes, why do they not decree that what is bad and pernicious shall be regarded as good and wholesome? Or why, if the law can make wrong right, can it not make bad good? Again, those who have made pernicious and unjust decrees have made anything rather than laws. Again, the law of all nations forbids one man to pursue his advantage at the expense of another. Lactantius says, justice teaches men to know God and to love men, to love and assist one another, being all equally the children of God. Leo X says, not only does the Christian religion, but nature herself cry out against the state of slavery. Testimony of the Nations, the Voice of Greece. Socrates says, slavery is a system of outrage and robbery. Aristotle says, it is neither for the good, nor is it just, seeing all men are by nature alike and equal, that one should be lord and master over others. Polybius says, none but unprincipled and beastly men in society assume the mastery over their fellows, as it is among bulls, bears, and cocks. Plato says slavery is a system of the most complete injustice. From each of the above and from other nations, additional testimony is at hand, but for reasons already assigned, we forbear to introduce it. Corroborative of the correctness of the position which we have assumed, even Persia has a voice which it may be easily recognized in the tones of her mortal Cyrus, who says, to fight in order not to be made a slave is noble. In Great Britain, no nation has more heartily or honorably repented of the crime of slavery. No nation, on the perception of its error, has ever acted with more prompt magnanimity to the outraged and unhappy bondsman. Entered to her credit, many precious jewels of liberty remain in our possession, ready to be delivered when called for. Of their value some idea may be formed when we state that they are filigreed with such names as Wilberforce, Buxton, Granville, Grattan, Camden, Clarkson, Sharp, Sheridan, Sidney, Martin, and Macaulay. Virginia, the Carolinas, and other southern states which are provided with republican forms of government and which have abolished freedom should learn from the history of the monarchical governments of the Old World, if not from the example of the more liberal and enlightened positions of the New, how to abolish slavery. The lesson is before them that a variety of exceedingly interesting forms, and sooner or later they must learn it either voluntarily or by compulsion. Virginia in particular is a spoiled child, having been the pet of the general government for the last 68 years, and like most other spoiled children, she has become forward, peevish, perverse, sulky, and irreverent, not caring to know her duties and failing to perform even those which she does know. Her superiors perceive that the abolition of slavery would be a blessing to her. She is, however, either too ignorant to understand the truth, or else, as is more probable, her false pride and obstinacy restrains her from acknowledging it. What is to be done? Shall ignorance, prejudice, or obduracy, or willful meanness triumph over knowledge, liberality, and guilelessness, and laudable enterprises? No, never. Assured that Virginia and all the other slaveholding states are doing wrong every day, it is our duty to make them do right if we have the power, and we believe we have the power now resident within their own borders. What are the opinions, generally speaking, of the non-slaveholding whites? Let them speak. End of chapter 5. Now, I'm going to say something here. Helper waxes very poetic in his books, but you have to remember one thing about him. Though he sounds like a radical abolitionist at times in the books, the man is a devout white supremacist. He basically wrote this book to sound like an abolitionist book in many ways, to get the support of the abolitionists. But in reality, he was for emancipating the slaves and then being rid of them altogether. In fact, his next book after this one, Negroes in Negro Land, will pretty much not leave any doubt as to what Helper believes, but ironically, he won't write that book until after the conclusion of the American Civil War. So this book was written in 1857, officially 4 years before the war actually began. So that's it for Chapter 5.